for joining us today for our informational webinar, Effective Safety Training. As I just mentioned, this webinar is informational only. This webinar is not eligible for continuing education credit or professional development hours. I received a couple of emails on people asking if there would be a completion certificate, and no, just to reiterate, this is strictly informational. Before we go ahead and get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be provided to registrants and attendees later on this week. If you're having any technical difficulties, right now I am talking, so if you see this screen and you cannot hear me, please use the questions icon, the questions panel, to let me know that you cannot hear me, or if you're not seeing my slides advance from the first screen, just use that and we'll respond to you directly. The questions function is there for your participation to comment or ask questions throughout the webinar. I'll be showing you a couple screenshots on the next slide in case you have any questions about where these might be located. There are also going to be a few polling questions throughout this webinar. We want to get your feedback, get you involved, and we will be asking for your participation. So when a poll question is asked, you will be prompted using the poll section to respond. There will also be a few open chat questions that you can use to participate in using that questions chat function. And lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that will allow you to opt in to a short series of weekly emails with additional resources. If for any reason you don't see the prompt to complete the survey at the end of the webinar, there will be one also emailed to you. So here are some screenshots for you. So if you have a question or you need to make a comment, you will be asking this in the questions panel. So where you see that panel, you can go ahead and enter your question there and then use the send function. If you are answering a chat question specifically, your prompt will change to questions chat, as you can see on the red arrow there, and you will just enter your response there and then send. So let's talk a little bit about who is presenting this webinar today. Vector Solutions is our parent brand, and we are on the commercial side, Red Vector and Convergence Training. And we provide online training for the industrial manufacturing, the architecture, engineering, and construction, and the facilities management spaces. My name is Casey. I am the marketing strategist for Red Vector and Vector Solutions, and I will be helping Jeff along with this webinar, fielding the polling questions in some of our chat, and my email address that you may have seen in your registration confirmation is where you'll send any questions that you may have after this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Jeff for him to go ahead and introduce himself.
All right, great. Thank you, Casey. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Fun to be working with you again. I always enjoy it. And hi to everybody who's attended the webinar as well. Thanks so much for coming in. My name is Jeff Dalto. I'm the Learning and Development Specialist at Convergence Training. And you're wondering who I am. I'm an instructional designer. I've been working in training for 20 or 25 years, safety training and safety for 20 or 25 years. And I'm one of, amongst other things, I'm one of a number of people who worked on the upcoming ANSI and ASSP Z490.2 national standard for online environmental health and safety training. A couple quick things about the webinar before we get going. We've done some practices. We think it'll take about an hour. If it does go a little long, you're welcome to stay with us. If you can't stay with us past an hour, we will send you a recording. There is a Q&A session planned at the end, but feel free to, as Casey discussed, to use the webinar tool to put in questions at any time. Casey and I will be monitoring that. We'll try to take things as they come up. This is part of a webinar series. If you're new to it, we did do one last month. You can go back to the Red Vector website and find it on New Safety, HOP, Safety Differently, and Safety 2. And next month, we'll expand one of the things we're going to briefly talk about today, evidence-based training, and go into more detail on that. So keep your eye, look for the past one, keep your eye out for the future one. Today, what we're going to talk about is just a few basic tips to help you create better safety training. If you're an absolute novice or have learned very little about safety training, we think we'll give you a couple of nice tips that you can immediately apply starting later today or tomorrow, and then a foundation of things you can apply longer term and kind of a usable method and places where you can continue learning. So that's our goal. If you're kind of already studied up a little bit on safety training, it's possible this will all be a refresher for you, although nothing wrong with refreshers. And maybe we'll surprise you with one or two things we mentioned during the evidence-based training section. Casey discussed the fact that she and I work for different companies. You're getting this webinar ultimately from the Red Vector website. I'm going to be mentioning articles at the Convergence Training blog throughout this webinar. So know that you can get those at the Convergence Training blog. A lot of those articles will be included in the follow-up emails that you can opt into. So remember, during the survey, you can opt into follow-up emails. I think there's 8, one a week, and those will include some of those articles. And I invite you to connect with me on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and continue asking questions and learning together there as well. And Casey, am I correct? Do I advance the screen from this point? Am I in charge?
You should be in charge.
All right. Okay, so here's what we're going to discuss today. We will cover ANSI and ASSP's standard for safety training, or EHS training, Z490.1. We'll talk about learning objectives. We'll talk about ADDIE, which is really largely what Z490.1 is based on. We'll talk about using human performance improvement and ADDIE together, and really just one small detail of that, but critical. I'll introduce you to something called backwards training design. We'll discuss some learning myths and some evidence-based training practices, and we'll go into that in more detail maybe next month. And then we'll talk about evaluating the effectiveness of your safety training. And before we do, we're going to jump right into a poll question, kind of get a sense of where you are and give you a chance to benchmark yourself against other people here in the webinar.
All right, great. I'm going to go ahead and open up our first polling question, which is, how well do you understand effective safety training? Do you understand it really well, pretty well, okay, not well, or not at all? So that is open, and we've already got lots of votes coming in. Also, feel free to make any comments in that question section that you may have about this polling question if you wish to elaborate on any of your answers. So Jeff, I'm not sure if you can see these votes coming in, but it's looking like the majority, with 44% of those responding, are saying that they understand effective training okay, with pretty well coming in second, and not well and really well kind of neck and neck with 13% and 9%.
Yeah, so a lot of people have some familiarity. That's great. Some people are, we got about 13% experts out there, also great. A couple, 9% are feeling shaky with what they know, and hopefully we'll be able to move you up the ladder there and give you some tips to get even better in the future. So that was helpful. Thanks to everybody for voting.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this polling question and send it back over to you.
All right, there's always a delay when I get the mouse back, so bear with me, everybody. All right, so one thing we'd like you to do here, and this is move on and do a chat and share some tips together.
Great, so using that questions function, I'm going to go ahead and send the question to everyone. So we want you to share one of your own tips for making effective safety training. So let's see what you guys have to say out there.
Tell us what your special sauce is. I see somebody saying, make it as hands-on as possible, trying on the PPE, etc. And I'm sorry, I can't see your name, so I apologize. But I agree with that. That's a great idea. And that was Carla. Rachel says to make it useful and timely. That's true as well. You want it to be relevant. You want it to be at the time of need. We'll talk more about that. Drew is talking about use of supporting audio visual that does not make you want to shoot yourself. Shooting yourself being bad and not safe. So that's a good point as well, Drew. But I like your point about using complementary audio and visual materials, being video rich and audio rich when it's helpful. Applying adult learning principles and making it applicable to what they do. And applicable, if I recall, is one of those adult learning principles. So good point from Matt. Humor. Terry is right. Humor can be helpful. Sometimes people will tell you humor is forbidden in training. I don't agree with that. You don't want to distract from training. You don't want to be offensive, but it can be helpful. Drew likes gamification and workshops, both of which are forms of interactivity and engagement. And gamification is a nice little hack, if you will, to help motivate people by applying lessons we learn from game design. You have to evaluate the training results. Training doesn't take place until behavior changes. So Dan is, we're going to get to evaluations. That's a great point. But you can't just deliver training and hope it works or assume it works. That's what he's talking about with evaluation. And it's true that training involves behavior change. So it's not just a recitation of a regulation. Give them the test first and see what they know. So like a pre-test idea, that's great as well. Sharing real life stories. Two nice things there, and this is from Bob, sorry about that. One, stories and storytelling, incredibly important in training, and two, being real life and relevant. So two great things there. Use photos and discuss real incidents. Yep, again, keeping it real, using multiple forms of video or media. Follow up for retention. Yeah, one and done training can be problematic. Sorry, I think that's me as I'm scrolling through the questions. I'm also moving my slides. We'll get back. Follow up for retention, the Kaizen approach. I'll be curious to hear, I'm a big fan of Kaizen. I'll be curious to hear from Carlos how he applies Kaizen to training. I'm not as familiar with that. Michael can't see the dialog box. Michael, we're over here in the questions section, if that helps. Jeff Altum, there's a name I know. Hi, Jeff. Make it interactive and get participation. Exactly, which is what we're trying to do here. Travis, site specific and related to daily activities. So keeping it relevant and applicable. Jeffrey, try to use a personal experience related to the topic, presumably in the form of, so it's relevant, of course, and presumably in the form of a story. Always think about whether you're promoting a culture of safety, which is an interesting point, and we might at a future time have a webinar on what safety culture means, because that's a bit of a, I think we all use that term, but maybe it's not as clear what that means. Offer the training in different languages, sure, and make sure people understand the training in the language they understand. Provide it in different mediums, absolutely, using short videos and being concise. Great, Charlene. Chris likes lots of interaction. We agree. Raul, try to avoid bullet points, which is, of course, the death by PowerPoint thing, which is overspoken, but bullet points on PowerPoints while I'm lecturing is exactly what's wrong with PowerPoint. Performance-based, learner-focused. Yeah, focus on performance, be learner-centric. What do they really need to know? And in addition, what do they need to know and do? But in addition, how can I design the training to help them learn to do that? Rebecca likes keep it personal. Good point, Rebecca. Hi, good morning to you. Michael, ask participants at the end, tell me one thing you learned from this training. That's a great point as well. You want to help support the transfer of training to the job. So that's one of the questions I hope to remember to ask you at the end of the day. No regional differences in safety culture, especially in different countries. Great point, especially when it comes global. Situational awareness, scenarios. Adults are problem solvers. Scenario-based content can accelerate expertise. Joel sounds like he knows quite a bit about scenario training. I agree with that entirely. I'd love to have an offline talk with Joel about situational awareness. Stephen, make it interactive. Absolutely. Scott, pound safety every day at all times. Repetition leads to learning and compliance. I agree with repetition. Pound, I know you're typing quickly. If your learners are experiencing as pounding, they might find that a little less engaging, but I get your point. And Irini, my own tip in video and dialogue. So tips, videos, dialogues, all good. Okay, thank you so much for everybody. Those are really good suggestions, and we'll get back to a lot of that shortly. And with that, I'm going to move forward here. Okay, so one thing I want to introduce you to is this national standard I've talked about a couple times, ANSI and ASSP's Z490.1 standard for environmental health and safety training. So this is an existing standard that I think it was last updated in 2016. So it's pretty current. And I would encourage you, if you're not using it now, if you're not familiar with it, to go out and get a copy. Having a copy of this is not going to make you the world's greatest safety trainer. It's not going to make you the world's most cutting edge expert safety trainer, but it'll definitely help you up your game, especially if you're one of the, I think 9% of people who said, I don't really understand much about safety training. The recommendations here are sound. There's a nice formulaic method. That method is repeatable. So I really encourage you to go out and get Z490.1. It's written by experts in the field, working for good organizations, and you know, I've read it all. I've gone through it. What they're saying makes sense, including much of what everybody said today, including that emphasis on adult learning principles. I do also want to give you a heads up. I mentioned if Z490.1 exists, Z490.2 is coming up soon. And that's a supplementary standard. It doesn't replace Z490.1, but it supplements it, and it deals with online environmental health and safety training. So that, as I understand it, is now in final format, and it just needs to be okayed by the two organizations and published. So keep your eye out for that. And much of what I'm going to tell you about here is kind of taken from aspects of Z490.1. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is something called a learning objective. And before I talk to you about a learning objective, I was hoping we could do the same thing and have a little discussion about that. Casey?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and also submit this for everyone to answer. And we want to know, we want you to tell us what a learning objective is. What do you think a learning objective is? So if you can see that chat, you can go ahead and respond to it, and you can just answer that question in the questions field. And I know Jeff had mentioned before that somebody could not see the dialog box. It should be in your control panel, and it's just where the question/chat feature is, so you just need to respond in there.
All right, and I see some things rolling in here. Thank you, Casey. Rachel says, what you expect from your audience when training is finished, whether that be a behavior or change to something. So I like that we're talking about what the audience is supposed to be able to do when training is done and expectations. See if I can read some more here. Dan says the purpose of the training, what you want the trainers to learn, and what's in it for me. So there's really three things there. Purpose of the training, yeah, but that might be, we can probably dial that in a little bit and make that more specific, which Dan does. What you want the trainees to learn, yeah. We could probably even dial in on that word learn. And then the what's in it for me. And I think what's in it for me is a way, a learning objective can help signal to the learner what's in it for me. What am I going to learn here today? I tried to do that with you today and tell you a few things we're going to cover. What the point of the training is, says Jennifer. True, but point of training can be a little vague, so we're going to try to zero in and make that more specific. Donald's predetermined goal to achieve. Nicholas, what you want the learner to take away from the topic being discussed. So everyone's right in there. take away from the topic being discussed. Remember, somebody said we want to make behavior change, so we're going to get at that. Carlos is talking about improving skills. True, we're going to want to change skills. Whatever the presenter hopes you will learn, the learner, says Susan. Matt, the information trainees need to know and apply when they complete the training. Jeffrey, what you're trying to accomplish with the training. And remember, we want to really be focused on what the learner can do after training. Brittany, what you want your audience to walk away with knowing, knowledge and behavior change, right? There, we're zeroing in here. Michael, change behavior and understand the reason for the change. Expected goal of the curriculum, true, maybe a little vague there. What is learned from the training? And Irini says no accidents, safe practice of work, which is ultimately true, but maybe one step beyond, and something we'll talk about a little bit more in training evaluation, but true as well. So thanks everybody once again. Those are good, all good thoughts. And my kind of basic definition of a learning objective is what the learner should be able to do when the training is over. So you're trying to create a behavior change, you're trying to teach them a skill, you're trying to see if they can perform something, you're trying to see if they can apply knowledge. So when you sit down to create training, one of the very first things you should do is figure out, well, why am I doing this? As we said, people have said, is what's the goal of the training? And you really need to sit down and say, what do I want the learners to be able to do after training so that they can then turn around and do that on the job on their own after training. And if you haven't focused in on that, then your training is just going to be relatively random and scattershot and less effective than it could be. So kind of job one, or at least a very early job, is figuring out one or more learning objectives to determine what you want learners to be able to do when training is over. That will help you when it comes time to develop your training content, because you're going to develop training content to help the learners satisfy that learning objective, and to create your assessment, a big word for test, so that you can see if your learners can satisfy that learning objective. Somebody, and I apologize, I don't remember your name, also mentioned the what's in it for me factor. So listing your learning objectives in advance to your learners, tell them what they're going to learn. It helps them focus their attention on key aspects of the training. And so that can be really helpful as well. And, I do this same talk at a conference, and I usually have people write learning objectives and evaluate them. We can't do that as much here today, so I do encourage you guys to study this up on your own. But I do want to give you two tests or sets of characteristics about learning objectives. One is to consider writing a learning objective that has up to 4 parts. This is kind of the classic Robert Mager model. Those parts can be represented by the letters A, B, C, D. And those letters stand for actor, behavior, condition, and degree. So the actor is the learner, the student, the employee in class. What do you want that person to be able to do after training's over? And kind of a classic mistake here is forgetting that your learning objective has to be focused on the learner and talking about what the trainer will cover during training. So remember, it should be learner-centered, meaning you have to have a learning objective that's related to what the learner can do. Behavior, what are you going to be able to do after training? So, it will be written as a verb. Conditions, under what conditions do I want to see you perform that behavior? Maybe it's like given this, X, Y, and Z, or maybe it's under normal production, under a normal production schedule or something like that. But the context in which the learner has to demonstrate the behavior. And then last is degree. How well do they have to do it, or how quickly? So maybe it's like 90% of the time, or maybe it's more important, 100% of the time, or maybe it's within 5 minutes or something like that. So when you're running an objective, at least consider these 4 parts. You may find sometimes your objective is fine without a condition or a degree, but consider them. And remember, you want your objective to be as specific as possible. You want it to be not vague, not ambiguous, not nebulous. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in this next set of criteria for learning objectives. And that's this acronym SMART. So you want, and a lot of this came up earlier as well, so hats off to everybody. You want a specific learning objective. I want to know what that means. It needs to be measurable. I have to be able to observe it. I have to be able to agree with Casey or somebody else that you have performed it. It's not up to my private understanding. It has to be kind of a agreed upon, understood measurement. It has to be something that's achievable. It has to be something you actually can do. I'm not going to ask you to build a rocket. I'm going to ask you to go out and do something on the job, unless you're a rocket maker. It has to be relevant to your job. And so we talked about that already. A lot of people mentioned that. And that's an argument against one size fits all safety training for everybody at your organization. You want it to be task specific or job specific. And then timely. You know, if OSHA has a new regulation coming out and you're changing rules as a result of that, and that rule change is coming up next week or next month, great. If that rule change is coming up next year, you don't need to be giving me that quite yet, that training. So remember the ABCD method, remember the SMART method. And we'd like to go to a little poll question here to see if we can apply some of that.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We are going to launch this poll question, which is, which learning objective is best? Is the learning objective to work safely, know how to use lockout machine X properly, explain the HAZCOM regulations, or safely complete forklift operator training at forklift obstacle course in compliance with all the aspects of forklift operator checklist? So this has now been launched for you to answer. I'll let Jeff kind of explain a little more about what these mean.
All right, so yeah, we've got 4 learning objectives listed top to bottom. As Casey mentioned, use your poll section. Tell us which one you think is best. Maybe none of these are perfect. And that's the great thing about training. And we'll talk about that in the training evaluation section. You will just continuously improve it over time. But we've got, the poll is in progress. We have 22% saying that the first one, work safely, is best. We have 25% saying know how to lock out machine X properly. We have 3% saying explain the HAZCOM regulations. And then 49% of us, or just about half, exactly half now, safely complete the forklift operator training. And you may remember there was more to that one, which we can't see at the moment. So the best answer here is that last one. Safely complete the forklift operator training. And then there's more, and we'll return to that screen and I can read that to you. But just kind of working from top to bottom, work safely, that is very not specific. It is very not measurable. So it's a nice goal to have for all of our workers, but it's very difficult to, I could sit there and observe people working while Casey's next to me, and we could disagree about who's working safely. It's also a massively huge topic for any one safety training, as opposed to something more specific like using a forklift or properly applying lockout tagout. So work safely is a great aspiration. It's maybe not a great learning objective. Know how to lock out machine X properly. So this is getting closer. This is good. Properly, again, is a little vague. Notice there are no conditions, there are no degrees. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. You could probably get a little more specific, but you see it's got a nice behavior. You're locking something out. You're telling me what I need to lock out. You're using this term properly as a condition. You know, again, maybe there's a way to make that more specific, so that, again, both Jeff and Casey could agree that the machine has been locked out properly. Explain the HAZCOM regulations. Now, this is really general and vague as well, but in addition, you know, this brings up the issue of teaching people knowledge as opposed to teaching them to apply that knowledge as part of a skill or performance, or just teaching them a skill. So explain the HAZCOM regulations. It's important to know what the HAZCOM regulations are. And if you're thinking about that knowledge-based aspect of HAZCOM and chemical safety before you think about what the tasks the worker has to do to work safely with that training, then objective like this is moving in the right direction. But again, maybe it's too broad for that awareness and that knowledge-based training. Maybe you should say, explain to me the label elements, explain to me what an SDS is, explain to me where the SDSs are kept. So this could be more specific. But it's also, you have to remember, nobody gets paid, or very few people get paid, at work to explain HAZCOM regulations. You're trying to teach them how to work safely with chemicals. So your learning objective should definitely include something about, how to read a chemical element, how to find an SDS and how to interpret it, how to work safely with a chemical. And then last one here, safely complete forklift operator training, a forklift obstacle course in compliance with all aspects of the forklift operator checklist. So we've got all 4 parts, A, B, C, D. It's specific, it's measurable. That operator checklist lets me measure it. So I encourage you to read more about learning objectives. If you opt into that follow-up email campaign we talked about, you will get a, 30-page guide on learning objectives, and there's a lot more to be learned as well.
Okay, Jeff, I have closed. Yeah, I've closed out the poll, so you can go ahead and take control.
All right, thanks. Now we're going to talk briefly about training delivery methods. And by training delivery methods, I mean the format in which you're delivering training. So is it instructor-led? Is it a video? Is it an online course? Is it virtual reality? Is it a written material? And oftentimes I ask for this, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag. Research has shown no one training delivery method is inherently better or more effective than any other delivery method. The delivery method itself actually is irrelevant to the effectiveness of the training. So training delivery method itself is not important. What's important is what we might call the instructional methods that you embed within that training delivery method. We'll talk more about these instructional methods, but this includes things like practice. It includes things like corrective feedback. It includes things like visuals. It includes repetition. So the first thing to know about training is there's no magic way to deliver training. You want to find the best way to deliver training to get those instructional methods in and use them with your learners. Now, sometimes a training format is maybe easier to apply a instructional method. It's pretty easy to use to get some hands-on training and to give corrective feedback and let people practice either in field-based training or in a classroom setting. And it's more difficult to do that in a video or a standard e-learning course. Although those e-learning courses can be scenario-based. I know somebody was talking about the importance of scenarios or simulations, and allow for that practice and that repetition and the consequence and feedback. So, but that's what's important. And the big takeaway here is you need to focus on instructional methods and instructional methods that truly lead to learning and lead to skill development and make more effective training. And the training delivery method itself is not important. Furthermore, really the best way to do it is to use what's called a blended learning solution. So you're using multiple training delivery methods. Again, written material, instructor-led classroom training, field-based training, e-learning, virtual reality, augmented reality, and so on, for the same training need and throughout your entire safety training program. The more you can provide training in multiple formats like this, the more effective learning you'll have. You might appeal to one learner who prefers a different kind of training, as opposed to, maybe they like written training as opposed to a video. You'll also appeal to the person who likes video more than written training. And even for that one person, approaching the same training topic from multiple different formats will lead to better learning and more effective learning as well. Z490.1, the standard we talked about, suggests the blended learning solution. Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark's famous book, Evidence-Based Training Methods, suggests a blended learning solution. Dr. Will Thalheimer, and that's all based on studies and data. Dr. Will Thalheimer's white paper, Is E-Learning Effective? Again, based on studies and data, suggests a blended learning solution. U.S. Department of Education's report, Evaluation of Evidence-Based Practices in Online Learning, all based on studies and data, suggests a blended learning solution. And all of these, especially Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark's book, Evidence-Based Training Method, has the data to back up what I said earlier as well. that the training delivery method itself is not important. That's not creates effective training. What creates effective training is those instructional methods. So those are all good resources. I would especially, if these are new names to you, I would encourage you to check out Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark's book, Evidence-Based Training Methods. And with that, I want to give you a quick overview of training development methods. Before I do, though, I want to see, Casey, do we have any questions or anything?
Yes, I was just about to say that we did have somebody, and I'm not sure if they were joining us later, but they wanted to know if they could have a copy of this presentation, and I just wanted to let everyone know, yes, after probably later this week, we will have the recording as well as the presentation available to not only all of our attendees, but everyone who registered. So yes, you will receive a copy of this presentation.
All right, great. Thanks for the question and thanks for the answer, Casey. I also see someone in chat, maybe some time ago, asked, tell us what a learning objective is. So that might have been answered, but if you did not get the answer to that, the answer, what is a learning objective, is it's what you want the learners to be able to do when training is over. You should sit down and write a learning objective before you start developing training. And it's the skill or behavior you want to see learners perform when training's over, and then again, perform that on the job. You'll use that to create training content that teaches that and nothing but that, and you'll use that to create an assessment to determine if workers can do that after the test, and then again, you'll go see if they're doing it on the job. All right, so we talked a little bit about learning objectives. We've talked about training delivery methods and instructional methods, mentioning that it's really the instructional methods that give you your bang for the buck. And now we're going to talk about just a quick introduction to different methods of developing training. And the standard way to do this is with a model called ADDIE. So some of you might be familiar with ADDIE. For others of you, it might be new. There are other training delivery methods out there. There are people who criticize ADDIE, although I've always found that most of the other methods still bear a lot in common with ADDIE. But it's worthwhile knowing what ADDIE it is. It's worthwhile trying to use it. And if you want to modify it for your own purposes, great. If you want to discard it for something like SAM or Agile, great. But let's talk about what ADDIE is. And this is a nice formulaic method for developing training. And it's largely what ANSI Z490.1 is based on. So each of these letters in the acronym stands for one phase of the process. The first phase is to analyze your training need. We'll talk about all this in a little bit more detail on the next screen. But it starts with analysis. And then you're going to sit down and design the training based on your analysis. You can think of that as like the blueprint. And now you're going to develop your training. You're going to implement your training. And you're going to evaluate that training to see if it was effective. And again, I remember people talked about the importance of evaluation already. And I just created this. I was all excited about this. I just created this the other day for you guys. A little bit more detail on ADDIE in each of the phases. Going from left to right, analysis in ADDIE, you start by analyzing the organization. What is the organizational need that we're trying to support with this training? What's the problem and what's the goal that the organization has? What is the actual performance that I might create training for? What do I know about my learners, my performers? What do they know now? What do they need to know? What kind of training do they like? What are their schedules? And how can I assess if they've learned it after training? So you should already beginning thinking about that post-training assessment now during analysis. Design. You're going to write your learning objectives. You're going to identify the essential material that you need to teach in order for people to satisfy those learning objectives. And the flip side of that coin is you're going to be very careful not to include additional content. In training, less is more. So get down to that core stuff that you really need to teach. You're going to think about how you're going to chunk and sequence that training. Chunking means talking about one thing and kind of like ADDIE, before you move on to the next thing. And sequencing is the order in which you put the information. I just learned in a webinar I attended this week, yesterday, from the ADDIE, Association for Talent Development, that there's data showing that if you chunk and sequence so that you're introducing something at a high level, like I did on the previous screen about ADDIE, and then go down into details like I am now on this screen, that you'll improve retention 40%. And that apparently is evidence and data-based. So that's pretty impressive. Selecting your delivery methods and media. Again, they don't create the effectiveness of the training, but you can find the best delivery method or the best blend for your need. Selecting those instructional methods. This is the stuff that actually makes the training work. Practice, feedback, visuals, and so on. And then design a follow-up campaign, because we also heard from somebody that sometimes one and done training is not enough and you need spaced practice or refresher training. So you can start designing that now. Development. You're going to develop your training content. You're going to develop student manuals and job aids if relevant, instructor materials, practice opportunities during the training and assessments. And then you're going to develop a beta test and actually do that beta test with a small audience before you roll your training out. Implementation, coordinate with instructors. You're not, just scheduling. Are you free? Can you do this? But also, this is what we're trying to teach. These are the methods we want you to work on. Coordinating with managers. All too often, trainers provide training, but they're not coordinating with managers. This is what we're trying to teach. Can you help support this after training's over on the job? Schedule with employees. Hey, that's helpful too. Don't just drop training on employees, but figure out when is the best time for them. And then obviously deliver that training in whatever format it is, instructor-led, e-learning, over time. Finally, evaluation. We'll talk about this more, but you can do that. A classic way to do it is in 4 levels. Learner surveys after the training, a test after the training, on-the-job observations after training's over, and then again, by tracking KPIs for your business goals. Sorry, I advanced my screen one too much. One thing I want to mention too, in addition to ADDIE, I want you to know about something called Human Performance Improvement, or HPI. So to my knowledge, I've made up this acronym HADDIE. And I just want to call out one aspect of HPI that you should consider before you move into ADDIE. And some people tell you this is already included in an analysis, and that's fine. But I want to call it out because it's really critical. And that is, when somebody approaches you and says, we have an organizational problem and we need training in order to solve it, you should not be an order taker. Your job is not to just blindly create an instructional event or an e-learning course or a training because somebody told you that's what you need. You should analyze the problem and try to get to the root of it and say, what's really causing this problem? And is training the right solution or the best solution? If training is the best solution, then go into ADDIE and create training. But maybe training is not the best solution. Maybe there's the workflow needs to be reconsidered, or there's a motivational issue. So always ask first, is training really the best solution? And if training is not the best solution, then don't make training. Do something else. Make a different recommendation. Create a different solution. But if training is the right solution, move into ADDIE or some similar method like ADDIE. And one last thing, and I'll see if there are any questions. A thing to think about is this idea of backwards training design, which we're representing here cleverly with the words backward training. And the idea behind this is, once you have those learning objectives during that design and development phase of ADDIE, move on and create your assessments next. Figure out exactly how you're going to assess your learner's performance on each of the learning objectives. And that way you'll have a nice, clean, much more likely you'll get a nice, clean assessment of those learning objectives. And then create training content that will help the learners pass that assessment, which means that they can satisfy the learning objective. So this is called backward training design. It's maybe a little counterintuitive. People usually would go from learning objectives to content to assessments, but at least consider this. You don't have to use it, but consider it, and you might find it helpful. We're going to talk about evidence-based training, but before we do, Casey, any questions?
I have not seen any new questions come through. Nope.
All right, everybody. Feel free to ask any questions. We'll do Q&A at the end. And I'm going to go into evidence-based training. I think you guys are probably all familiar with this idea. Clearly, we're familiar with this idea of evidence-based medicine and so on. And it's an idea that we should, in medicine, we should be using medical interventions where we have evidence and data showing that they're actually effective. And I think we, in medicine, we probably all agree with that. That sounds like a good idea. And it's the exact same idea in training. You should not just, be providing training using methods that you hope work or that you believe work. What you should be doing is using training where using methods that we have evidence proving that they work. And so that's the idea with evidence-based training practices. There are a lot of evidence-based training practices. There are a lot of learning researchers who share them. I'm going to give you their names at the end. I recommend, or some of them at least, and I recommend you follow them on social media or buy their books. Before we do, one method is this idea of learning styles. You guys are probably familiar with this idea. The idea is that every one of us fits into usually one of three different learning styles. It's the way we learn best. And some of those styles include learning by seeing, learning by hands-on, as represented in the middle, or learning by hearing. And I think we're going to go to a poll here, Casey.
All right, yes, I'm going to go ahead and open up this polling question to everyone, and that is, does developing training for learning styles help? Launching that now. Do you think yes, developing training for learning styles helps? No, or you're not sure? And if you're not sure, let's get some feedback at question section.
All right, and I am seeing currently 97%, 95% saying yes, developing training to accommodate learning styles helps. 2% say no, 2% say not sure. So thank you everybody for that. I think this idea of learning styles is one of the most commonly heard and commonly believed ideas out there for how to create effective training. And the surprising thing behind it, this idea is common. You hear from everybody. You can Google it. You can hear learning professionals saying it's true. But what's interesting about this is there's no data suggesting this helps. In fact, this idea of designing training to accommodate the different learning styles of your learners. In fact, extensive research, including studies and meta-studies, have shown that designing training for learning styles does not help and even makes your training less effective. So I think probably a lot of you might find that a little surprising. I admit I did when I first heard about this some time ago. I don't know what I heard, but so I would invite you to if you're trying to develop training for learning styles with the assumption that Casey learns in one way and Jeff learns in the other, I would suggest you abandon that and try to incorporate some of the methods I'm going to talk about right now.
Jeff, I'm not sure if you saw, but there were a couple comments on that as well.
I did not.
And the questions, no worries, in the questions section. Pam said not anymore. Drew said yes, but target all learning styles. And then Marco said how you evaluate competence. There is some kind of strategy. And then there's a yes, but you have a little of all reach to all learners.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me try to, so Pam's saying not anymore because she saw my article a week or two ago and mentioned it. So gotcha, Pam. Target all learning styles. Yeah, I think it's true that you should create training. Drew's saying this, and I think I saw it again. Create training that includes, hands-on, that includes visual, includes audio, and create a diverse that appeals to all senses and that creates a diverse training experience. That's true. And so some of you might say, oh, that's not a big difference. But this idea of appealing to everything for your entire audience is much more effective than this idea of trying to tailor your training with the assumption that Casey's an audio learner and Jeff's a visual learner. In fact, we're all highly visual learners. How to evaluate the competence. I think by competence, we're talking about the competence after training. That's coming up next. So I'll hold on that, Marco, but good question. Dan says the same thing. You have to use a little of all. Again, if you use that diverse training experience, you're going to get better benefits. Absolutely true. But doesn't having someone practice doing something the most effective method? I don't know if it's most effective, Michael, but having people practice is highly effective. So you're absolutely right. And having them practice again and again, and having them practice where they're under the observation, where they're seeing consequences of their action. That could be in real life, like, oh, you crashed the forklift, or using a simulator. That's very helpful. Getting feedback from a experienced person it's like a learning accelerator. So if I'm telling you what you did well with the forklift and what you didn't do well, that's incredibly effective. There's a great book called Peak by Anders Ericsson about that. It's called Deliberate Practice in that very method. Practice with consequence and instructive feedback. So whether or not it's the most effective thing, I don't know, but there's a ton of data showing that it's effective. Isn't that the definition of blended? Blended actually traditionally meant I'm going to give you an e-learning course and then we're going to talk about it in class. But blended is one of those terms that, to my understanding, but blended is one of those terms kind of like safety culture, where people use it to mean a whole bunch of different things. And in your mind, I don't care if you say, I want to create blended safety training by creating a whole bunch of different, including a whole bunch of different elements, that's fine. And I'm behind that general idea that the more diverse the training experience, the better. All right, great. So if that's the most good contributions from everybody, and thank you. So if learning styles is the most famous learning myth out there, quick overview, and we'll talk about this more next month. A couple others: telling somebody something is the same as training. Training can't include humor. We touched on that really early. Rich media always improves training. Visuals, audio, all of this can improve training. It doesn't always improve training, and sometimes it detracts from training. Sometimes a really simple drawing is more effective than a super detailed one. Visuals definitely help, but it doesn't always have to be super detailed and super complex. That's great for you because you can scribble something on a whiteboard and it would be effective, or you can take a picture, or you can use some clip art. And if it supports what you're trying to teach, it'll be effective. You don't have to make something really fancy. Millennials are an entirely different species. They're from Mars, and I don't know how to train them. That's not true. Millennials respond to the training in the same way that we all do. The human attention span has changed due to modern life and all of our electronic gizmos, and the attention span is only 7 seconds. Also not true. And all you need to do is think about Netflix and binge watching to know that people can pay attention for more than 7 seconds. The modern learner learns differently. Also not true. We evolved to process information and learn over a very long time. I've forgotten how many years we've existed as a species. Our cell phones did not change us that much in the last 7 years. Microlearning is the silver bullet for all training needs. Microlearning is great. It's not the solution for everything. Neuroscience has taught us a lot about training. Neuroscience is a great field. It has a lot of promise. We've learned almost nothing from neuroscience about how the brain works that we can literally apply to training development, maybe in the future. But that's a little overview of some learning myths for you there. And let's talk about some actual evidence-based, let's talk about how people learn, kind of a model about how people process information. And then we'll talk about some evidence-based training practice that help support this model. At any one time, we're kind of getting bombarded by sensory stimuli from the outside world. And our sensory memory filters almost all that out and allows us to kind of be aware of a small amount of it. Some of that information goes to what's called our working memory. This is what you are consciously thinking about at the time. And you can only think about a small number of things at one time, maybe 3 to 5. And normally it'll fall out of your working memory in 15 seconds or so. It won't get stored and it'll just be lost. In some cases, it'll be transferred to long-term memory where it'll be stored in what's called a schema in your brain. It'll be associated with other knowledge that you have. making neural connections. And then at some future point, you can actually retrieve that information and transfer it on the job. So if you think about these 4 steps here, when you're developing training, you can do things to facilitate the movement of, knowledge and or skills and the development of skills from left to right. And you could also do things that interfere with all these processes. And that's really when the evidence-based training methods come in, is because they're facilitating this process, or they're not, not interfering with it. So a couple quick points, we'll talk about these more in a month. The first is when training starts, you want to awaken prior knowledge. When somebody learns something new, they're going to store it into long-term memory, and they're going to make neural connections with prior knowledge that's related to it. So you want to start training by getting people thinking about things that are related to this new topic. If you think about today, I started this webinar by saying, who's a good safety trainer? And tell me your tips for safety training. I did that to awaken prior knowledge so that I can start telling you more about safety training, and you can integrate that information into these schemas, and you can make these neural connections, and that will strengthen the long-term memory process in something that we call encoding. So awaken that prior knowledge. This is exceptionally powerful and valuable. Storytelling, we already talked about this. Humans are hardwired to pay attention to stories. They're hardwired to listen to stories. They are hardwired to remember things that were embedded with stories. And stories are very effective at motivating us to actually do something. And you have to remember, part of training is not just teaching me like some knowledge or teaching me how to perform a behavior, but actually motivating me to want to do that later. So storytelling is great for all of this. There's all sorts of great ways to tell sources for safety stories. All of us that have our own works safety stories, we can go off to the Chemical Safety Board and get their videos. We can go to the OSHA fatograms or the MSHA fatograms or whatever, any of those sources. Keep it short. We already talked about the fact that the brain can only process a small amount of information in working memory at any one time. So the shorter, the better. Take out that extra content from your training material. Try to keep it as short and focused as possible. Try to chunk things and let people practice on things before you move to the next chunk. And there's chunking. So again, this is a way to organize content. It's a way to break it up into small units, and that will help with the processing. Visuals. We use all of our senses to learn, but we use our sense of sight much more than any of the others. So if you can incorporate visuals into your training, that's great. Is it 3D? Cool. But you can use a whiteboard as well. You can use clip art. You can use a picture. Any visuals will help. Well, any type of visual will help, and then you have to design the visual so that it supports what you're trying to teach. Realistic practice, and I think we've already touched on the importance of practice and feedback. That feedback, again, can be consequences, like you tip the shelf over, maybe hopefully in a simulator and not in real life, or just the experienced worker explaining what you did well and what you need to improve on. But again, this is one of the most evidence-based ways to teach people, is letting them practice and giving them feedback. And then spaced practice. One and done training is not as effective as it could be, and in fact, often quite ineffective, because people quickly forget things and forget how to apply things. So you want to keep coming to that same training topic over and over again over time. It's called spaced practice. You can come at it from different approaches, maybe using a different delivery method. And this is a good use for what we call microlearning. So if you do your HAZCOM training in January and it takes an hour or 2 hours, and you can't give that amount of time every month, maybe you can use a short little microlearning course delivered on a telephone, on a cell phone, and it just asks me to apply one bit of information on Monday morning, and it takes me 60 seconds. And then retrieval, with that space, either during your primary training or later during that refresher training, if you will, instead of asking someone to recognize something, like in the form of a multiple choice question, ask them to actually actively retrieve it from their mind on their own. I started training by kind of asking you to, kind of retrieve your own ideas on safety training. If you sign up for the follow-up email campaign, I will ask you to try to remember what we said about learning objectives. Try to remember what we said about training evaluation. I'm not going to write a multiple choice question where you can just identify the correct answer. I want you to get the gears grinding and retrieve this information for your own brain. And that's going to strengthen those neural connections, make it more likely you'll keep this information in long-term training, and make it more likely you'll apply it later. All right, so that's our quick interview to learning myths and evidence-based training practices. We'll get back at this in a month. Here are 1,000,000 great sources, 1,000,001 great sources for evidence-based training. I recommend you follow these people on social media. I recommend you buy their books. In particular, I'm going to call out Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark, her book, Evidence-Based Training Method. I'm going to call out in the right-hand column, Julie Dirksen and her book, Design for How People Learn. And then everybody else on this list is great as well. And
all right, Jeff, I just wanted to point out that we've kind of gone a little bit over the 2 o'clock mark, so we know that people probably may have other meetings or things they may need to get to. So just want to remind everyone that this webinar session is being recorded, and the recording and presentation will be made available to you. But for those of us that are still sticking in there, we're going to open this up for chat, and that is, tell us which evidence-based practices you use and how you use them.
All right, and apologies for people for going over. We'll wrap this up in probably less than 10 minutes, but we are curious to hear what you're using. Okay, and I think this is, am I looking in questions? I think I am.
Yes, you're looking in questions.
Hello to Jennifer Jennings. After reading extensive studies on tips for retaining information, I have included photos of cute baby animals in my safety training PowerPoints. So I believe Jennifer is making a joke, and that's a great example of how not to use a visual, I think, unless you're trying to teach something about cute baby animals. But that's a great point because it shows you that the image has to be directly related. So visuals are effective, but you have to pick the right visual. Pam is talking about Bloom's taxonomy for learning objectives. I think it's a useful method. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's an idea that we can teach cognitive skills, things you do with your brain. We can teach psychomotor skills, which is a big way of saying things you do with your body, physical skills, and then attitudes or emotions, which gets back to that motivation thing we were talking about. So you can write, using these Bloom's taxonomy, you can write objectives for cognition, for physical skills, or for attitudes and emotions. And then there are different, there's a spectrum of cognitive skills, there's a spectrum of physical skills, and there's a spectrum of emotional skills. So it's a valid method. People do criticize it sometimes, but I think it's a good foundation. Let's see what else we have here. Okay. All right, I think those are the comments I see. Am I missing anything, Casey?
Haven't seen any new comments come in. So again, if you're still on the line and you have some comments on this, you can go ahead and use the chat. I see one more came in from Laura, if you can see that one, Jeff.
Yeah, and so Laura wants to know if she can use cartoons related to the topic of the training. I have found, for example, images of unsafe act by The Simpsons. So I will raise the issue of copyright law, and which I am not a lawyer, and I don't even play one on TV. But I will encourage you to investigate copyright law, and be wary of copyright law. The internet is a fun place because it makes you feel like you can kind of take anything and use it anyway. However, just addressing this issue of can I use a cartoon? Absolutely. And it probably has elements of visuals, it has elements of storytelling, it's probably got some humor in it. In general, it's a great idea. I would, maybe talk to some legal experts about some of those things. But good point, Laura. And then I see something here about problem setting challenges scenarios can be used to activate previous knowledge, exactly, and experience before reviewing the learning content presented during the course. And that person's name didn't come through So I apologize, but that's a great point. And there's this idea of in learning called desirable difficulties. These are difficult things that make learning more effective, and therefore they're more desirable for training design. And this idea of having somebody, assessing somebody, presenting a problem or asking a question and making them answer it or solve it before you actually tell them how to solve it, it is a desirable difficulty. It's an exceptionally valuable training method. So I think that's a great point. And I apologize, I don't know who made it, but
that came through from Joel Bertrand.
Thank you, Joel. Oh yeah, I just didn't scroll down far enough. And then Nain says test and workshop practices about the topic. So that's another thing. Tests. That I didn't include this as an evidence-based training method, but it is one. The testing effect is an evidence-based training method. If you include assessments, it's more than just a CYA activity. So you can check a box and say, yeah, well, I trained Casey and here's my test that proves it. The test itself will help Casey or Jeff learn. So testing is really valuable as well. All right, good input from everybody there. Thank you. And we're gonna go into some tips. Oops, one more from Laura. Laura has made safety inspections on the workplace after training. Perfect, Laura, and that's gonna come right to what I wanna talk about and where we're gonna end our webinar at. And that's this idea that when you design, develop, and deliver safety training, you shouldn't just sit back on your chair and congratulate yourself for the job well done and leave it at that. You have to actually see if the safety training was effective. So that's what we're going to talk about here. There are different models for determining if your training was effective. The kind of standard one is Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of training. You should be familiar with it. You should try using it. You should learn some of the others. There's the success case method. Will Thalheimer has one called LTEM. There are others. There's some criticisms with Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of training, but it's solid. And again, I feel like in a lot of ways, it's repeated in some of the other methods. But here it is, 4 levels of training. First, get the learner reactions. They're in training. Ask your learners what they thought about the training. We'll talk about that in more detail. This is often done with a survey. Those surveys are often called smile sheets or happy sheets. The assessment or test after training. That's an obvious one. On-the-job behaviors, which I think is very closely related to what Laura's talking about. Go out and see if people are really doing it in the field. And then tracking some kind of larger business goal to see if your training actually help move your organization toward that goal as measured by some metric. A couple tips for each of those 4 levels. Level 1, you'll never get the world's greatest information from a learner survey, partly because people are really bad judges of whether or not they've actually learned. And there's evidence behind that as well. However, part of it's because a lot of the surveys we write are poorly designed. We don't take courses on how to write a good survey question for post-training. And a lot of some of the classic problems with the surveys we create is they deal with, did you like the training? Did you like the trainer? And they also deal with, they give answer options that are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that really may mean, they're kind of meaningless, frankly. And my 3 might be the same as Casey's 2. Or maybe they've switched that into like strongly agree and strongly disagree. But those words are vague and meaningless too, to some degree. So what I would encourage you guys to do is to ask for very specific, actionable information. So for example, the survey question should be, after this training, are you now confident you could apply this skill safely on the job? And then you can get, yes, your answer options could be something like, yes, I'm 100% confident I can do this. Or, yeah, I'm kind of confident, but I could use some additional support, or I'm completely not confident about this. That will give you really specific actionable information and make it clear both the survey taker and the survey evaluator what you're talking about. And the other thing I would say is use comments field when possible. Try to get raw, unfiltered comments from your learners. Level 2, test taking. again, there's a lot to be said about creating tests or assessment after training, but make sure those tests are truly evaluating your learner's ability to satisfy learning objectives. If you do that, you're doing a lot that's in the right direction. Those tests, when possible or when necessary, might assess knowledge, but try to assess skills and performances, and then even the ability to apply knowledge. That's a skill. And I guess the last thing I'd mention is don't try to write trick questions. You're not trying to provide training to see if people are clever test takers. You're trying to provide training to see if they can perform their job. So if you're thinking about tricky test questions, just don't do it. Level 3, absorbing things in the field. And again, Laura just talked about this. Go out and see after training, see if people are doing it. If they're doing it, applying those skills, give them recognition, give them praise, give them support. If they're not doing it, give them a gentle reminder, and then investigate and figure out why. And maybe it's because your training was bad and you need to revise it and re-deliver it. But maybe there's, again, something else going on and it's not a training issue, but they're being told, the employees are being told to ignore training by their manager, or for example, or something else. But so go out there and see what's going on and see if things are going well or if the ship needs to be righted. And then lastly, during that very beginning part of analysis for training, you should be asking yourself, in ADDIE, if you remember in analysis, the organizational analysis, what is my organization trying to get out of this training? And then you identify that business goal, and then you identify what metric is used to evaluate progress towards that goal. And then you take a benchmark pre-training measurement and you continue monitoring it through training and after training. So that's the basic idea. There's lots of interesting thoughts that we could have and discussions about what would be an appropriate KPI to measure for safety training. Some of you know that incident rates are used heavily, but also criticized. There's criticism over the use of that. So that's a different webinar, but something I invite you to give some thought to. And that wraps us up, and we'll take any questions. Casey, any questions?
I haven't seen any new ones come in, but again, you guys can use your questions portion to go ahead and ask those. And this recording will also include any questions and answers. So feel free if you guys have any questions.
Yeah. All right. So I'm looking in the chat. I'm looking in the question section. I hear something. Thank you for the presentation. Well, thank you, Scott Stevenson, for your time. I hope this is useful. Feel free to, I guess I remind everybody, there's a short survey. As soon as you try to close out of this webinar, there'll be a short survey. You can tell us how we did. You can tell us what you'd like to hear about in the future. And you'll have an opportunity to say, yes, I would like to get a weekly email for 8 weeks, and we'll send you more material. I also encourage you guys, if you're interested, connect with me on LinkedIn. I share information, including from a lot of the learning professionals I mentioned earlier, on a daily basis, and would be happy to kind of continue learning more about effective safety training with you all. Nain says, I asked PSM training with certification. Nain, if you could clarify that, are you saying you want PSM training, or that you certify? You do deliver PSM training and certify people, or if you give us more information about that, that'd be helpful. Nicholas, as a novice, what should be our top 3 takeaways have been from this meeting? Nicholas, great question. Use learning objectives, write them, and apply and create your training using them. Use a formulaic safety training development method like ADDIE. Go out and buy yourself a copy of ANSI and ASSP Z490.1 and follow it. And also know the follow-up email campaign has a 60-page safety training guide that I wrote that's kind of similar and supplements it. And then follow these learning researchers, use these evidence-based training practices that really do make your training more effective. And then I know that's already 4, and then I'd say evaluate your safety training. I think those are the 5 tips. Sorry about that if I gave you too many. Anybody else? Well, I think we might be there, Casey.
Yeah. Oh, we've got one more from Laura.
What do you suggest for online training? Okay, so Laura, one, I suggest you use it. You should consider online training as an arrow in your quiver for any training needs, including for safety training. If possible, online training should include, effective training visuals. It should include, the kind of elements we're talking about. Does it include scenarios? Does it include storytelling? Does it ask people to apply information? Does it give in a realistic work-like manner? Does it, the things that they would do at work? All those kind of things. But I would use it in a blended solution like we're talking about. I do like, somebody talked about the flipped classroom model. I believe we talked about that. And that's the idea, or blended. And that's the idea that you would maybe use online as a way to kind of introduce a topic, to deliver knowledge. And then you can use that classroom training afterwards for questions and for practice and skill demonstrations and feedback. So I hope that helps. Laura, if it doesn't help, feel free, my email, jdalto@convergencetraining.com. Shoot me off an email. I'll be happy to talk with you about that more. All right.
I don't see any more coming in. And also, if when you close out and you do not see the pop-up for the survey will also be emailed to you as well. So don't feel like you need to complete it twice. If you see it when you close out and then get it in email, it's just a follow-up for those who may not see it.
All right, great. Thanks, Casey. And everybody out there, thank you so much for your time. I hope you found this valuable. I do look forward to connecting with you in the future, and watch for future webinars.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.